patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 132 of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman Tylowski. Thank you all so much for joining me for this interview episode. If this is your first time listening to Friends and Fellow Citizens, welcome aboard. Thank you so much for joining us and hope you will enjoy this episode and many more episodes to come. As always, a big shout out to our Patreon supporters who are so ardently helpful with our podcast. So once again, a big thank you to them. And of course, thank you to our listeners for subscribing. If you haven't subscribed already, be sure to check out the link down in the show notes below. You can subscribe to our email list to get notifications right to your inbox when new episodes come out, or you can also subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Today's guest is Dr. Jeffre Crean. Jeffre Crean is a professor of history at Tyler Junior College. He received his PhD in history from Texas A&M University in 2017. His research interests include the interaction of U.S. foreign relations with domestic politics, as well as war and public opinion. He has previously published articles in War and Society and Diplomacy and Statecraft, among other journals, along with book chapters for the Vietnam War and Popular Culture, and Peace, War, and Partnership, Congress, and the Military since World War II. He's also the book reviews editor for the Journal of American East Asian Relations. His first book, The Fear of China, An International History, will be published by Bloomsbury Press in January 2024. Jeff actually wrote a letter of recommendation for me when I applied for my PhD program, so I would not be here without his help, so I really just thank him so much for not only for his teaching and research, but also for his generosity as well. All right, everyone. Well, I am very happy to welcome Dr. Jeffre Crean onto the program. Jeff, thank you so much for being on the program. I know it's been a while since we've seen each other in person, but it is fantastic to have you here.
Yes, and it's an honor to be here. I'm very happy to be here to talk about my project.
Fantastic. Well, one of the things I want to bring up is that, of course, Jeff was an instructor when I was a first year at the Bush School of Government Public Service. It was about leadership in international affairs, and there's a lot of focus on the presidency, but also just leadership theory and whatnot. And certainly leadership is probably going to come up at some point in our conversation. Before we get to the meat of our discussion, Jeff, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself? I know we had the bio, but anything you'd like to elaborate about your background and how you really got interested in this field. We're going to talk about China, U.S., and a little bit of history today.
Very good. Okay, yes. I am from Rochester, New York, in Western New York. And I came down to Texas in 2010 to get my doctorate in history at Texas A&M. Before that, I had actually, like yourself, been pursuing a doctorate in political science. I got a master's from Marquette after college. And then I went to the University of Illinois and, like you, was studying international relations and did that for 2 years. And then at the end of the 2 years, the department had sent me down and said, Jeff, you're a historian, not a political scientist, and just go try to do that. And that's what I did. That is relevant to this discussion because basically the topic, which kind of was the germ for what this book is, goes back to Illinois. It goes back to Illinois, where when I was at Marquette, I started reading about, more in depth about diplomatic history and warfare and international relations and how countries relate to each other. And what I discovered was kind of, the importance of public opinion, going back to the 1800s, especially extending in the century and today in terms of influencing government policy or either encouraging governments to do things or acting as a veto against governments not doing things. And I had seen this as kind of an omitted variable. This was something which a lot, which realist theory generally didn't take in, or even liberal theory didn't take in, and I just basically thought this is something that needs to be studied. So when I got to Illinois, I decided to study it, and as part of that, I was kind of looking at how do we gauge, how the people of one country view another country, and I looked at different examples of that. And the thing I wanted to focus on was called rivalry shift. So think like Britain. For a very long time, Britain's biggest enemy was France. And then for a little while it was Russia, and then of course by 1900 it was Germany. And and then like between in a 10-year span, Britain went from being rivals of France and Russia to being friends with France and Russia and rivalries with Germany. So I looked at how that happened. What was the role of the public in that in Britain? Were they leading? Were they lagging? What political parties were saying we should be nicer to France? What were kind of hewing to the old ways and the old views? And so that idea was important. One of the problems with that, in terms of making it more, in terms of quantitative and in a political science framework, was the number of rivalry shifts is fairly small. But one of them is, of course, with the U.S. and China. So I looked at this, and so obviously during the early Cold War, U.S. is rivals with the Soviet Union, very obvious. But China is always in the background, or in the case of the Korean War, the foreground. So there's a lot of sentiment against China that in some ways exceeds its danger, its threat to the United States. And I was looking at this, and by then, of course, 1950s, 1960s, you have poll numbers, you have Gallup and others doing questions and finding out what Americans think of different countries. And when I was looking over these poll numbers, I saw that there's two poll numbers. So this whole project goes back to like two poll numbers in an old Gallup book. And 1961, China's becoming enough of an issue for Americans that Gallup asks, which country is a greater threat to world peace, China or Russia, which is what they use for the Soviet Union. And 2-1, people say Russia, but still it's notable that like 30% of Americans think China is a greater threat than Russia. And that's March 1961, right when Kennedy assumes office. Then 2 years later, March 1963, after the Berlin Wall's built, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, they asked the same question. And now 60% of Americans say China is the biggest threat to world peace, not Russia, which is odd because what's happened in the last 2 years? A lot of stuff with Russia, a lot of dangerous stuff with Russia, very little dangerous stuff with China. And so I'm like, why does this happen? This seems very odd. And you have to look at kind of cultural factors and issues of threat as opposed to capabilities, and how people gauge threat, and the sense that China was not rational at the time, its leadership compared to the Soviet Union. And so I looked into that. And furthermore, that fear increased. So it increases through the 60s, even as China's not getting stronger. Eventually, about like 1967, 3-1 Americans view China as the greater problem. And then even in 1971, when Nixon decides to go to China, still 2-1 Americans view China as a greater threat than Russia. So, that is a second interesting thing, that even as Americans are warming to having better relations with China, reaching out to them, talking to them, then they're still very afraid of them. So what I got to thinking of is, classic political science way, this is counterintuitive. Maybe the threat is what's causing this, that because Americans are so afraid of China, they want to reach out to them to kind of make nice with them and lessen the threat that way, that China is kind of so popular. You can't defeat it. It's, even, compared to Germany and Japan, you can't conquer it, you can't defeat it. By then they have nuclear weapons. So you have no choice but to, in some way, accommodate it to try to make it less of a threat then, and especially going forward. And that's, I couldn't do that at Illinois, but basically I took that topic, brought it to A&M, and added archives, but basically the exact same topic. And that was my dissertation, which formed the kernel of what this book is. So that's kind of how I get here. And again, it reflects, political science and pursuing what you're pursuing, probably less well than you're doing it, but the same idea, and that long journey. So how I got into this subject, it's a bit haphazard. It could have been some other country or some other rivalry dyad, but it wasn't. It was this one. And I mean, in terms of history, I had, lots of different interests, European history, ancient history, Chinese history, they're all American history. There were all sorts of different subjects that interested me. It just happened kind of, I fell into this as what I focused on for this kind of, almost a random sort of reason. So that is how we get to where we are today.
Well, that's a fascinating overview of just how the histories of interest that you had, from Illinois to Texas, and you're still in Texas now. It's just wonderful to hear from someone who has this broad interest, because we like to always kind of, I think generally we like to silo histories as to like, okay, just American history or just English history. And while there's reason to, I think, focus on specific kinds of history, however, so much of it is entangled. There's that quote that history is told by the winners, so you explore kind of seeing how the narratives change over time. So it's just fascinating to hear your perspective, Jeff. Just before we get to more about the history of U.S. China relations, especially those early episodes, I'd like to first ask you a bit about your time at the Bush School. We've had a number of people from the Bush School on the podcast, and I'd just like to ask if you could briefly reflect on your time there and what you think the school represents to you and to future students who come through those doors.
Okay, so my first interaction with the Bush School was not as an instructor, but as a student. In the spring of 2013, I took the Chinese politics course with Professor William Norris. So I took that with Will Norris. He was on my dissertation committee, and stuff. And as the outside field person, very natural fit. By the way, if you want to see something interesting, I've seen him sing "Cheap Trick's Surrender" at karaoke. A live band karaoke they had in Bryan, Texas one time. Yes. So I started off as a student. So I did that, when I was taking history, getting my doctorate in history. Then 5 years later, I am a professor there, which is an interesting change where you go from in a very short span of time taking graduate seminars to teaching one. And so yours was the first of 2 semesters I taught at the Bush School, and it was very enjoyable. Different view of things than in the history department. There's plenty of history there, but there's also lots of theory and other ways of looking at these issues. Also, the speakers you guys would have come to the Annenberg Center and stuff, which when I was in the history department, another 2 miles away, another part of campus, I was somewhat less aware of than I should have been. But then when I was there with you guys, I could see, excellent speakers and be aware of them and go to them. And that was very enjoyable, those sorts of social events. And in teaching, again, the students, it was a bit of a shift. So when I was teaching you guys, it was Monday afternoon. So Monday morning, I'm teaching American government at Blinn College to community college students. So I'm doing that for a couple hours in the morning. Then I drive over and teach you guys. So that, a marked contrast in the level of students, not only their expertise, but especially their interest in the topic, and the way you teach it. Discussing readings in your case as opposed to more standard instruction in their case, and so that was quite a shift after having taught, undergraduate and community college students for several years by that point. Kind of going to teach a graduate course, and it was very fulfilling, especially your class in the fall, the way the students just automatically start talking about the sources and offering their opinions and stuff. So it's a natural sort of conversation, and I liked it very much in that regard. And also putting together the syllabus on a specific topic I hadn't had much prior direct background in, especially in terms of leadership theory. Putting that together over the summer when I got the course at the last minute, offering it to you guys, and then also reading your assignments, because since you're an advanced course, I can give you more advanced assignments. So you guys wrote research papers based on research at the Bush Archives, and you guys did very well in that. So that was very enjoyable reading, completely different than the sort of essays I'm grading at a community college. So all of that was, very kind of eye-opening and enjoyable to do.
That's wonderful. And I particularly remember that time going to the Bush archives, going through some copies and original documents. And it's just, it was such a great exercise. I want to thank you for giving us that opportunity to use a national treasure of archives about a wonderful man and public servant, George H.W. Bush. That kind of depository right next to the school, I think really shows the level of interest and salience that history has within international affairs. Even though we focus so much on the contemporaries, there's a lot of history that backs up whether it's policy, whether it's relations, or even personal characters, or whatever it is in international affairs. The history really shapes that. And this is a great transition to the early stages, really, of probably the relations that really have shaped the world. But did you want to add something to that?
One more thing I want to add. Well, you mentioned the Bush Archives. So my first experience with them was when I was taking a political science course there, and on the American presidency with George Edwards in the political science department. And there, for our final paper, I did a thing on George Bush and his efforts to convince Congress to pass a resolution endorsing the Gulf War in January 1990. And so that was my introduction there. And in fact, that led to additional research at the Bush Archives, where I did a paper on Bush's telephone diplomacy during that period, talking to foreign leaders, how he convinces them to be on his side, which leaders he gets along with, which leaders he does not. And that ended up being my first published article in 2014, War on the Line. So my own experience with the archives has been very fruitful as well, and also kind of keyed me into, how leadership works, in real time, how George H.W. Bush ingratiates himself to foreign leaders, deals with kind of obstreperous foreign leaders, and and those sorts of things, and the arts of persuasion and personal relations and how they impact diplomacy and international relations. So I just wanted to add that.
Absolutely. And the people there are fantastic. And I can't tell you how many times people were chatting in the hallways, hoping that the Tiananmen Square archives would finally be declassified. But I think it's going to be a while.
Perhaps. Yeah.
But let's go into the early stages of U.S. China relations. I find this fascinating because in American history, at least, my understanding is that we delve a bit into maybe the relations, of course, between the American colonies and the Britain, and of course, in the early parts of American history with the birth of the country. But there's just generally not that much that's taught about particular relations between the early country, and I'm talking like in the 1800s, when things are much more established, and other countries. I think one of these is China. We developed relations with China on trade and a number of issues. But I'm curious to know, Jeff, what were the kinds of early diplomatic episodes that defined U.S. China relations in the 1800s that eventually probably morphed into something very different, particularly when the dynasties were overthrown?
I'm very glad you asked about that. So America, it's an Atlantic nation, but even before it had real estate on the Pacific Ocean, it saw the Pacific as the future. So New York City, occupied by the British, 1776. They only evacuated November 1783. And then the next spring, 1784, some New York merchants are sending a ship full of Kentucky ginseng around South America to China. And it comes back 2 years later with lots of Chinese porcelain and tea, and makes a lot of money. And so that was there from the beginning. For instance, Franklin Roosevelt, his I believe his grandfather, his great grandfather, made a lot of money for the family engaging in trade with China, which he would mention to the Chinese during World War II when they were our allies. Like his sense that he knew China, he understood the Chinese people because it had once been the family business. What Roosevelt didn't mention and probably didn't know was the main thing his ancestors sold the Chinese was opium. That the U.S., the British had opium that they made in India. The U.S. would get opium in the Mediterranean from Turkey. Those Barbary wars, from the shores of Tripoli that the U.S. is fighting is to protect our opium ships that are going to Turkey to get opium and selling it to China as well. And that kind of reflects the kind of the heart of the early relations with China, that we see them ourselves as benevolent and helpful, like, Roosevelt, seeing, not being aware of the nature of his trade and his family's trade with China. That will lead over the course of the 1800s to disillusionment on the part of the Chinese for Americans. Towards Americans. There is, for instance, a great book from the early 1980s by a professor, Michael Hunt from the University of North Carolina, about this relationship in its early years, called The Making of a Special Relationship. And the title is intentionally meant to be ironic. And basically, while America saw China as the future, the Chinese also admired the early United States, because by the First Opium War, they're getting beat up by Britain. And they see America, a weak country that beat Britain in one war, tied them in another war, in the War of 1812, and basically made themselves strong and able to protect themselves. And so China's like, we can be like America. We can learn from America. Plus, America presumably does not like Britain because of these wars. So we can use America against Britain. And so forth. The whole what they call barbarian management and in China, play one enemy, one outsider against another. So the Chinese, there were kind of Confucian mandarins under the Qing dynasty who saw America as something that they admired and would try to find out what they could about America and how our economy worked, how our government worked. They often would describe George Washington as like America's good emperor. That they would see him that way, and that was, but they were soon disabused of that, basically because the U.S. wanted things like Britain and the Europeans wanted, specifically trade with China. So after the First Opium War, Britain signs the Treaty of Nanjing, opening up ports, and then a couple days later, an American diplomat shows up to basically include them in this treaty. And the same thing happens after the Second Opium War and later conflicts, that the U.S. is kind of looking for the same advantages, kind of like, I want that too. And by the late 1800s, the Chinese government officials are referring to the Americans instead as second chop Englishmen. That they're just like, they just come in the wake. The English beat us up and the Americans come. They're nicer about it, but just like, oh, what he got, I want that too. And so that that's the first thing that causes the Chinese to be disillusioned on America. The second one, of course, is the treatment of Chinese immigrants in America in the late 1800s. The Chinese Exclusion Act, mob violence against Chinese in numerous American communities, and the Chinese Protest Act. And in fact, in 1905, during Teddy Roosevelt's administration, there was a boycott in China where they boycott U.S. goods, and U.S. Exports to China plummet. But the problem is it hurts the Chinese more because there are plenty of Chinese merchants who handle the American products, and they're suffering. So the boycott goes away, but it's an early example of kind of the Chinese literate, emerging middle class and stuff, basically, publicizing this through newspapers and up and down the Chinese coast, don't buy American products. And obviously Americans don't like that the Chinese are doing that. There's a lot of pushbacks. So early on, the Americans come with lots of good intentions in their minds, but the Chinese soon feel that the Americans are kind of very hypocritical, that they talk an idealistic game, but they're really just like all the other foreigners and that who want to exploit China. And so that is important to understand when America gets involved with China in the 20th century and in the lead up to, the communist takeover. So I guess what was called in China the century of humiliation, which was a phrase that was actually created and promulgated not by Mao Zedong, not by the communists, but by Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek. They brought this idea that the Chinese had been beaten up, and that was their way of fostering Chinese nationalism. This idea of the Chinese have been beaten up by foreigners and have to rise up and fight back. And their view is America was a part of that. They were complicit in the century of humiliation, whereas Americans, were not able to see it from the Chinese point of view. So there was always this sort of a tension between how Americans viewed the relationship and how the Chinese people viewed the relationship. And that was important because it led a lot of Chinese intellectuals in the 1920s to turn away from America as a model. Mao Zedong, who as a teenager admired George Washington. He finds other role models later on, obviously, and that they start to gravitate towards first the Japanese, where Sun Yat-sen uh, and Chiang Kai-shek both had spent a lot of time and were influenced by, and then later on Russia and the Soviet Union. And so that whole thing is important to understand in terms of the kind of the crossed wires between the Sino-American relationship long before they become enemies.
That's wonderful to hear, like just there's how everything connects, with the different countries. And I didn't know that Mao Zedong actually admired George Washington. I'm not sure how George Washington would feel about that. I think what you've done very well, Jeff, is that you've really shown the importance of perception too, and the lack of it. Because it seems like we're seeing some of those themes in a way. While it's not, I don't think it's repeating itself in the sense that the world was very different in the 1800s. However, some thematic elements seem to be repeating itself from history. This idea that we don't see China's perspective on these kinds of elements. We don't see how other countries have seen this relationship, perhaps. So it's very interesting to kind of to hear that. The other thing I want to remark, and something I'd like to, I'll frame in a question in just a sec. The meaning of China is 中国. 中 obviously means central, and 国 is kingdom. So it means a central kingdom. It kind of sees itself as a central kingdom. At what point in history, or maybe points of history, do you think China began to see the United States as a larger threat to China's central kingdom?
Okay, I'm glad you brought that up because, the Chinese view, I'm glad you used the term central kingdom as opposed to the more common middle kingdom because it's more revelatory and accurate in terms of their self conception. So, the Chinese word for America, again, they have terms for different countries. The Chinese word for America is actually beautiful country. That's what they call us. So, like when they're talking about the evil imperialist Americans, they're talking technically, if you translate literally, as beautiful imperialists. So they always had that in theory, they thought well of America, and every Western country has kind of this sort of these nicknames, sort of how they refer to it. So China, with the United States, in terms of how it views the United States, it takes a while before it views it as kind of a player in its own right. I'd say probably the early 1900s, when others start to see America flex its muscles, that China gets that sense of America as a powerful nation. So it's very much in real time in that way in terms of how the Chinese sense America's rising power. But again, it moves very slowly. So the U.S. in 1898 acquires the Philippines near China, but it's still not nearly as involved in China as the British or as the Russians or the Japanese or even for a time the Germans. So the U.S. is still kind of on the outside looking in China for a very long time. I would say the change happens with Chiang Kai-shek. So when Chiang Kai-shek kind of rises to power around 1927, 1928. His chief enemy is the British. So when he's, around the time he's rising to power, there are riots in Canton and, near Hong Kong and in Shanghai basically against the British. And there's even an incident where there's striking workers in Shanghai who are fired upon by British soldiers, causing, a massive diplomatic incident and further Chinese unrest in China. And so the British at first are the main target of their ire. When he takes power, and the British are worried about excited Chinese nationalism and things. And what happens then is the U.S. doesn't know what to do. Calvin Coolidge is president, uncertain what to do, and the U.S. Congress forces his hand. Again, the idealistic part that Congress, reflecting American opinion, immediately prods the president to recognize him as the new government. Because at this time, the official government of China was still in Beijing. It didn't control much territory, but Chiang was just a usurping warlord. So the U.S. kind of leads the way in recognizing Chiang Kai-shek and making other governments unwillingly fall in line. And so I mentioned before the Chinese playing the barbarians against the others, one against the other. It doesn't work for the Qing dynasty. but it does work at first for Chiang Kai-shek. He is able to do that in ways where he gets some of the exploitative, what they call unequal treaties, which is, by the way, a term Chiang Kai-shek comes up with, the phrase unequal treaties, which has entered our lexicon for the agreements the British and other foreigners made the Chinese sign in the 1800s when they were weak. He gets some of that undone, quite a bit of it actually, and is able to increase Chinese power in a way with American help, especially diplomatic help. Other countries are helping him more. His party, after all, the Kuomintang, was formed by the Soviet Union. And also at this time, their military is being trained by Germans. So there's other countries that are helping. But the U.S. diplomatically is playing a big role in legitimizing what he's doing. So that kind of is when the late 1920s, early 1930s, when the Chinese realized the sort of the power America's has, which they can wield for good sometimes, to help China, and so that I believe is when it begins. Obviously, by World War II, it's unavoidable that the U.S. is the major player in the Pacific and so forth. But I would say it goes back, and that's often forgotten, that period of Chiang Kai-shek's rule, what they call the Nanjing Decade, his decade of rule before he's fighting the Japanese and so forth, when China still has rebellions, especially the Communist Rebellion, but is relatively peaceful, and he's trying to build a state and sees the U.S. as a partner helping him out. This is also when American missionaries found what will become most of China's major universities. They begin as colleges set up by American missionaries or American educators affiliated with missionaries. And that is an important legacy in China, too. Also, setting up medical colleges, setting up hospitals, things like that. Because, like, for instance, after the Boxer Rebellion, the European countries punished China with a very heavy indemnity that they'd have to pay. And it was one of the things that helped overthrow the Qing because they had difficulty raising the money to pay it. And what would happen is the U.S., all the different countries that felt they had been wronged during the Boxer Rebellion got a share of the reparations. But the U.S., what they did with their reparations money, they took it, but they invested all of it in development in China, basically building schools and hospitals and things. Again, the sense of America as a different country. That's a early example of it. The U.S. immediately took all its indemnity money and used it within China. That is a important legacy to understand the role of foreigners in China. That China sees itself as a central kingdom, and that also is one of the reasons Westerners early on in the 1800s, before they have fear of China, they have contempt for China. They have contempt for China because the Chinese see themselves as superior. They're the central kingdom. Everyone else is inferior. They refuse to deal with any other country diplomatically as an equal, at least in theory. So there's a sense with Westerners that the Chinese are very full of themselves, but they are also they're undeserving of it. They need to be put in their place. And when the first Opium War happens and begins in 1839, most Americans are against it. They see it as Britain beating up on this country, trying to force drugs on them. It seems very immoral to Americans. But the one major American figure who defends the British is John Quincy Adams, the creator of the Monroe Doctrine, one of the giants of early American foreign policy. And he gives a speech where he basically says, the Chinese are inferior and they need to be put in their place. They need to be taught, that they're just another country and not that great a country at that, and that they deserve what they're getting because of their arrogance and the arrogance of how they treat foreigners and so forth. It is not received well. It is not received well in America. Of all people who stand up for the Chinese and who stand up for the equality of nations is John C. Calhoun. Because by this point, Quincy Adams is very anti-slavery. So Calhoun sees this as hypocrisy in this way. That, and so of all the people who would, you would think would stand up for a non-white nation, the South Carolinian does. That is so that is an important part, that the Central Kingdom part grates Westerners the wrong way. Some Americans, but especially Europeans, and makes them, almost induces and encourages them to be even more violent, to be even more predatory towards China, because they feel they're getting disrespected.
That's great. I mean, just to hear the different elements that you brought up about how these different countries felt about one another, it seems like we oftentimes forget that because of the histories that have preceded the creation of the nation state that we know, after Treaty of Westphalia and all that, but we forget to remember that a lot of these countries, even within their own words, in their own names, convey a sense of superiority and of a centrality. And as you rightly point out, the Middle Kingdom, Central Kingdom element, which, as you brought up, it's a bit ironic nowadays when China's critiquing the U.S. but saying "beautiful country 美国" to call them. So it's interesting how these things kind of play out. Again, the fact that Calhoun obviously is nowadays is not seen. I mean, certainly a very big figure in Democrat politics and whatnot, but I'm sure he probably will want to try to get as much credit on anything as possible nowadays.
Yes. Yes.
I want to now go to a question that I think some people have had, which is, when Nixon goes to China, people have this sort of idea that we're going to be building relations and certainly still a very monumental time. But what puzzles me is how you have all this chaos that was happening in the 1960s, and there was upheaval everywhere. A lot of times, Americans forget that there was so much upheaval in the 1960s in China, clearly with the rise of the Chinese Communist Party, with the Cultural Revolution. Of course, that Cultural Revolution still looms today in Chinese society. My question is, do you think that there was a gross misunderstanding of U.S. China relations, with the benefit of hindsight, of course? But do you think there was a gross misunderstanding of China as a rising power, particularly with the communist government that was taking over, and that you think has led to some of the mistakes and some of the issues that we are encountering with China today?
Okay, so the important thing always with China is to remember its actual current power with potential future power. So in the 60s, Americans in general knew China was weak, and by the late 60s was in some ways becoming even less of a short-term threat. But the long-term threat situation was different. So you have the short-term threat, China dissipating because it's complete chaos that is being caused by Mao with the Cultural Revolution. But the idea is the long-term economic and especially military threat had not abated. In fact, was seen as getting worse because 1967, height of the Red Guard's depredations and mob killings and destruction in China. That's also the year China detonates a hydrogen bomb. So China gets the H bomb that year. They had detonated its first nuclear weapon in 1964. Now they have the H bomb. And soon they'll have more. And there's all these writings in the U.S. government about when will China get an ICBM and get to potentially deliver that H-bomb to the U.S. And they correctly predict by 1975. So the idea is China has a lot of people, and always it was assumed, even before the communists, but especially during the communist period, eventually China will get its act together. The government will stop self-sabotaging in disastrous ways, and it will become economically successful and even more militarily powerful. And the idea was even before China was seen as a potential economic threat and an economic power, it would have nuclear weapons and the missiles to deliver them. And if they hated us then, that could be a very dangerous situation. And that was not only the case in America, but also in Europe. Like Nixon, before he becomes president in 1966 and 1967, he does these kind of statesman-like tours of East Asia and Western and in some cases Eastern Europe. So he's going around seeing all these dignitaries, showing how important he is, but he's also gauging their opinions on issues. So, for instance, all the figures in Asia, even very anti-communist ones like Lee Kuan Yew, are now saying you got to go to China, got to be nicer to China. And the Philippines, their foreign minister, Romulo, what he said, he actually tells Nixon twice, first in 1966, then in 1967, you need to go to China. So that idea is already being bandied about, at least by him. And in Germany, Willy Brandt, the new who will become later on, who will be the chancellor of Germany. What he says to Nixon is, and this is a great quote. He goes, they have 800 million people and they have nuclear weapons and they live on a bowl of rice a day. And we know Brandt did this because in Nixon's handwritten yellow legal pad notes, he wrote parentheses Cup's hand. So it's almost like, Brandt, the socialist West German, is kind of channeling Kaiser Wilhelm II from a century earlier in terms of the Gelbe Gefahr, the yellow peril, and so there was always that worry about the future. And so yes, China's a basket case now, but it's not affecting its future power. None of the bad stuff that's happening in China is affecting its future power. In fact, behind the scenes, they got an H-bomb. They're developing missile technology. It's only getting worse. And so that is always important to understand in the 60s, in this situation, that even Nixon, when he's president, is talking about future Chinese power to Americans and about how it's something America will have to deal with. And in terms of how the Cultural Revolution and China's downslide in that period affects what Nixon does, it kind of offers an opportunity. So if China was super successful at that time and rising economically and whatnot, it would have almost looked like a tribute mission, like supplication for the U.S. to go there. But since China was weak, there was like a window of opportunity. There was a window of opportunity where Nixon could go, and it wouldn't look like appeasement. And so forth. It would, the U.S. could pretend it was in a position compared to China of relative strength, and that affects it in a way. So there's a bit of complex things going on there, but the future power is always assumed, and thus, even when China is weak, even when China is screwing up and shooting itself in the foot and everywhere else, the Chinese are still going to be great later on.
Reflecting on the incredible history that has gone by over the last several decades with China, remarkable. I remember going to the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, California, and there was a lot of discussion there when you go to see the exhibits about that, and fascinating to see 50 years on the impact that Nixon had. Such an important episode that I hope is taught more in school, even though a lot of things have changed, but this new era that has defined international politics for all these years is still a legacy to reflect on. And since we're now kind of more in the present day now, or at least in the last few decades, one of the things that I'm picking up a lot from your discussion is, of course, the inclusion of public perception, which is something that I think is often overlooked. We often think of like public opinion in terms of winning elections, right? Like Franklin Roosevelt, certainly with the development of Gallup, and there's all, even actually going back to the founders who numbered them, dismissed public opinion because they felt in a federalist society, when you have elected representatives, you shouldn't be counting too much on public opinion because the purpose is to elect people who have, just generally as a theoretical thing, or just they have more of the knowledge and the expertise to be able to make decisions rather than the general public. But let's kind of fast forward to the last few decades here, just generally, based on the developments that have gone on, even up until the last few years. What do you think is the significance of the history of U.S. China relations in terms of people's understanding nowadays on the crafting of U.S. foreign policy? How do you think that there's been a realization that our foreign policy, our relationship with China is far more complicated than what we like to think in terms of just the relationship over the last few years?
Yes, especially in terms of the number of actors involved. So when Nixon goes, American businesses want to get into China, but they're not terribly influential in the process, and that will carry on for about 20 years. During and so forth. Into the early 1990s. So, the public is involved in a way in that it helps Nixon. Nixon knows that going to China is not a risk, really. Some of the conservatives in his party will grumble and be upset, but they're still going to vote for him. And meanwhile, a lot of other people will like that this is happening, that this could help end the war in Vietnam and stuff, and will help him with the youth vote and with non-Republicans. So he sees that as it's a good thing in that regard. What really changes is first Tiananmen, which kind of causes a lot of Americans, at least temporarily, to sour on China. Which had enjoyed very, strong approval and warm beliefs about in the American people that had felt warmly toward China throughout the 80s. That, of course, plummets. Bush finesses that in his own way, by realizing it's in his interest for a variety of reasons to go easy on Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese leadership and kind of bring them back into the fold as soon as possible. But then, obviously, Clinton uses that against him in the campaign. So Clinton very much, attacks him for that, for kind of cozying up to the butcher of Beijing and standing Brent Scowcroft there so soon after the massacres and all that. And Clinton means it. So Clinton intends to kind of leverage the United States' power to change China when he becomes president. And a bunch of things happen. First, it doesn't work as easily as he expects it to. Secondly, there's American business. So 1993 is really when kind of the Fortune 500 companies start having an influence, and they want more trade with China, and they don't want Clinton using that as a lever to influence Chinese treatment of dissidents and at that time the Tibetans and things like that. They don't want that because they want to make money, and that really doesn't take place before 1993. It wasn't the case under Reagan, wasn't the case under George H.W. Bush. So now business is getting involved, and he has people like Robert Rubin, his first Treasury Secretary, mentioning that to him. And there's a split in his foreign policy advisors, and eventually the pragmatic side, the engagement side, wins out in that way. So you have the public involved. You also have business involved. On the other hand, you have military issues, which will become bigger later on. Early in this period, there's still a fair amount of military cooperation with China. There had been in the 80s and 70s to counter the Soviet Union, and then it continues in certain ways after the Cold War. And you have joint exercises and military leaders meeting and things like that. So you have a variety of actors involved. The public anger about Tiananmen subsides pretty quickly by the mid-90s. And Americans, once again, have a positive view of China. And in fact, from like 1992 until about 5 years ago, Americans had a positive view of China, a net positive view of China, and that has now gone away. That has obviously gone away, and that affects politics too. So Trump put tariffs on Chinese goods, pretty steep tariffs on Chinese goods, and Biden has kept those. He would probably, in all likelihood, not have done that on his own, but the tariffs are there, and he believes it would be politically disadvantageous to remove them. That he's was seen as cozying up to China, potentially hurting American industry and so forth. So he's kept those, and that again shows how public opinion works on these matters, and in that way that the different actors getting involved and so forth, and business community, security individuals. The general public as a whole, Congress, which tried to kind of pressure Clinton to be tougher on China in the 90s, but in the end always relented and backed off. These are all important kind of, limitations on what the president can do. That the president will not necessarily do things because the public's telling him to, but the public can keep the president from making certain steps which presidents believe could be in the nation's interest. So that is how I would define the role of the public and different sectors of the public on China, that it shifts over time and it impedes and it narrows what the president's options are in a given period of time. And so forth.
Public perception plays a big role. I mean, I think a lot going back to what you've been saying, this idea that there is the domestic politics element of how people can still play a role in foreign policy, which I think could maybe define the expectations of certain people about how there might be less salience among the public in terms of particular elements of foreign policy, right? Like in terms of the technicalities and the complexities, but it's interesting, especially when issues become salient, right? When it affects jobs, when it affects how people perceive national security. That's when it seems like the public perception plays a pretty big role. Just very brief, how would you kind of remark on just the role public perception you think will play over the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, maybe just down the line when it comes to U.S. China relations.
Yes. Now, it's, I think, at this point important to bring in Taiwan into the picture. So again, Americans now have a more negative opinion of China than they have for quite some time, actually. That has, but on the other hand, in terms of what the American people are willing to do to confront China, that is more limited. So Taiwan, which to security professionals has been a huge issue since 1950s. So that's been a huge issue they've always paid attention to, and the government, about what the U.S. policy should be. Should it be strategic ambiguity? Should it be more open alliance with Taiwan? Things like that. So to policy elites, that's a huge thing and has been on their mind front and center for a long time. For the public, really not. For the public, there's not as much of a sense of this. That there's this thing where the U.S., basically does not want China to have Taiwan and is willing to fight to keep China from having Taiwan. And China is a major military power. They're a nuclear power, just like the United States. So what's going to happen if war happens? And I think if war happens in the next 10 or 20 years over Taiwan between the U.S. and China, it's going to come as a shock to the American people. It won't be like the Cold War, where they knew there were troops in West Germany, and at any moment, World War III could start, where Americans were very cognizant of that sort of thing and aware of the risks and the stakes. I don't think Americans are aware of the stakes of a war in Taiwan and would be quite confused if it began and you start having downed U.S. planes, sunken U.S. aircraft carriers, troops being sent over there in harm's way. That would, I'm not sure how prepared Americans would be for that. And honestly, I'm not sure how supportive Americans would be for that, that it's not something Americans have thought about, that they're willing to start this massive, be involved in this massive conflict with the Chinese over Taiwan. And I think that is important because that has, Xi Jinping seems less likely than his predecessors to kick the can down the road and just adopt strategic patience when it comes to Taiwan. He seems to be going in the opposite direction. So the other thing with the public is what they're aware of, that very often things can sneak up on them and affect them in a massive way. And if it's something like a war, which the public is not prepared for, the effects of it are entirely unforeseen in terms of how the public will react, whether they will support it, how much they will support it, especially if it goes on for a long period of time. I believe that is something which policymakers really haven't considered, because to them, Taiwan is front and center. It's a massive issue. It's been for a long time, but they don't understand how in the dark the public is. Even understanding what the situation is with Taiwan, what its legal status is, what the history is there, those sorts of things, what the stakes are, why the U.S. would go to war to keep China from forcibly incorporating Taiwan into the People's Republic of China. These things are, could be very important in the near to medium future. And that is something to always keep in mind. What the because the last thing the public wants to be surprised about is a bloody and costly war, and that is very important to understand and to be cognizant of going forward.
That's why it's so important, I think, for people to get to know these issues and to be able to learn more about the history, whether it's through other events or through podcasts like these, and just trying to get that understanding of the salience of these issues. A very important point that you make, Jeff, and I hope that members of Congress and policymakers keep that in mind as they craft new policy as things go along. Now, before we conclude, just a couple more questions. I'd like to first give Jeff an opportunity to preview his upcoming book, The Fear of Chinese Power. Give us a sneak preview of this book that is coming out pretty soon.
Thank you, Sherman. So that is The Fear of Chinese Power and International History. It's available on Amazon and other booksellers now, scheduled to be released in January of next year, 2024. And it looks, again, it's international. So it doesn't just look at U.S. fears of China. It looks at British fears, German fears, Russian fears, Japanese fears, Australian fears, how the whole world has viewed China, not just in modern time, in our more recent times, but going back to 1880. So these fears of China go back even when China was very weak, and in terms of its population and its potential. So you see quotes like from 1920 that almost look like they could be written yesterday. Same with quotes from 1960 or 1890, and so forth. So there was always that sense of that worry about the future, and it affected how people dealt with China. It affected issues like how you deal with Chinese migration, which was restricted and banned not only in the U.S. but Canada, Australia. The Soviet Union, Mexico, Peru. This was that was this idea of Chinese individuals were seen as threatening, as kind of a economic threat to people. And so forth. And the idea was if these individual Chinese abroad can be so successful, my goodness, what if the hundreds of millions back home are just as successful or just as productive? What's going to happen then? So you have that's kind of the first part of the book. Then the second part of the book is the rise of the Communist Party and worries about them. That China is now able to defend itself, but also able to project power into Korea, into Vietnam, creating all sorts of problems and wars for the United States. Then the final part is our more contemporary era. China developing economically, first under Deng Xiaoping, then under later leaders, and becoming more assertive at, militarily and security-wise as it becomes more economically powerful, and how the U.S. deals with that. That's kind of the third part of the book. The first part is called The Dragon Stirs. The second part is called The Dragon Roars. And the third part is called The Dragon Soars. And so now we're at the period where kind of all these predictions going back to 1880, they by and large have come true. And the U.S. and the rest of the world has to deal with that. And it deals with it in different ways because, China is a threat to Japan, but it's also a major trading partner with Japan. Same with Australia, whose economy is heavily dependent on China, but has great fears of Chinese power and influence and things like that. The U.S., same sort of thing. And so there's this intermingling, this enmeshment between nations who really don't like and are suspicious of each other, which makes the relationship even more complex. So that is how what the book is about, and up to the present situation where China is now not only powerful but aggressive, willing to throw its weight around, willing to no longer be so humble, investing in other countries through its Belt and Road program, building, military bases in the South China Sea, threatening neighbors, and that is where we are today. And I look at, how we get here and where we go from here in terms of going into the future, in terms of the relationship with China between the U.S. and its allies and China's neighbors, and the prospects for the future. But it's important, again, to understand how we get here and the patterns over time. So that is how I do things, and where I go and how that's kind of the quick summary of the book. And if you have additional questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Sounds great. Well, I will actually put the link down in the show notes below for people to check out. And certainly I will share this, especially when January comes around. And I look forward to purchasing it, Jeff, because it sounds really, really interesting. And I just hope that Capitol Hill gives you a book signing event or some kind in the Capitol complex, because I really think this is something that, or at the Pentagon or wherever, like there's got to be better understanding of how we got here. And one of the limitations, I think, of just generally, and it's not necessarily just because of the members, it's just, when you have, for example, in the House of Representatives, always new members coming in, there's always that level of uncertainty of how much understanding there is on these particular issues, especially if they're on the Foreign Affairs committees, right, or they're on armed forces. So my unofficial shout out to all of our representatives to hopefully check out this book.
Speaking of which, the important thing to understand there is not only the history, but also China's point of view of that history in the present situation, about why China may see us as an aggressive power when the U.S. doesn't feel it's that way. As Mao Zedong said to an American reporter once, you have our Taiwan island, we do not have your Long Island. So in their view, we're right up to their border. We're right next to them. It's the equivalent of China having, military bases in Mexico. It's how they see what we're doing, and that they are, and as if they had ships in the Caribbean. We are in their backyard. They are not in our backyard. Why are we calling them aggressive? So that again is important to understand how they view the world. That, to us, China is 6,000 miles away. To the Chinese, America is 100 miles away. We are right next to them, and they are not right next to us. And so they, we see them as expansionists, but they see us as having done that long before in that regard. And that is important to keep in mind when you deal with China, when you deal with an issue like Taiwan and so forth, trying to understand how to appeal to them and how not to appeal to them, how not to say things that will backfire.
Very well said. It's kind of like how our perceptions of time, like 100 years for us is such a long time, but for them it's like a week. So if you were to kind of see that asymmetry between the two countries in terms of perceptions of time and place. Now, Jeff, let's move on to our final question for this podcast, and it is about tying in with the values of Washington's farewell address. We're looking at patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, and civility. How does our conversation and the topics we cover today apply to Washington's farewell address, and also in relation to nowadays?
Very good. Okay, yes. So your question about Washington and his farewell address and his overall foreign policy views lines up pretty much exactly with what I say in the conclusion of my book. So in that farewell address, Washington is, he's both talking about the situation overseas, but even more so about the situation in America. That America in 1797 was a lot stronger and more prosperous than it had been when he became president in 1789. And that would happen in the future. So his idea is America will once again be powerful enough to defend itself from all comers, from all rivals, from all threats. But in the meantime, it should, kind of look after itself and be careful and not make foolish mistakes as it's rising in its power. And so that's Washington's idea that if, the greatest enemy to America is not the British or the French or whoever. It's Americans. It's Americans messing things up at home. And that is a lesson we need to consider today, not only looking at the U.S., but also looking at China. That again, there's all these comparisons to the Peloponnesian War, this Thucydides trap in that idea. Well, what people forget there is the turning point in the Peloponnesian War was Athens sabotaging itself by invading Syracuse in Sicily, basically half the Mediterranean away, and losing a large part of its army and navy, which is what leads to its defeat. So Athens does itself in, and the Spartans only really take advantage of that after that happens. So that is an object lesson for how great powers can fall. And what they do to themselves, because that's what they have control over. They have control over their own decisions, and they should be prudent in that regard, which is kind of, I believe, at the heart of what Washington says is in his national address. And that also applies to China. That China has been doing things lately which have hurt its economy, which have upset its society and so forth. And so if China fails to rise to be, as powerful as it hopes to be, it's going to be less because the U.S. does anything to kneecap it or, affect it, but the Chinese screwing things up themselves, messing things up themselves, hurting themselves. And we're already seeing that in terms of lower growth rates, China's economy now bouncing back from after the COVID lockdowns end, as everyone expected them to, and things like that, in part because the Chinese system is set up in a way where it has all these vested interest groups, businesses, banks, especially government officials, who don't want to change the economy in a way which will shift it into continued growth in the future because it threatens their power base and their interests. And they're kind of stuck in that sort of, kind of rut going forward. So again, it's important to remember that what the U.S. can control is our situation, our political situation, our economic situation, and it's the same with China. And that is important to always be cognizant of, to understand that we can control what you can, and what you can control is your own backyard, your own domestic situation, and that I felt was at the heart of what Washington was saying. That my successors don't screw this up, don't tear the country apart, keep on this even keel going forward, and then the situation will take care of itself. And that I feel is the most important lesson Americans can take now in terms of how to deal with China going forward.
Amen to that. We certainly have a lot to reflect on when it comes to Washington's farewell address. I mean, it's read in the Senate every year, but I think the question is, are we listening? Are we really? And when I mean listening, like, are we listening to those words and doing better as a country? Are we finding common ground? Are we keeping the faith? Are we doing all these things? Very, very important that you bring these up, Jeff. And thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. I mean, I remember when I was in your class on leadership, international affairs, and I will tell you right now that ever since that, I knew that you had such a huge amount of knowledge about these critical areas. And I think especially when foreign policy becomes these tests for leadership, when there's so many things that are out of your control, when domestic politics can be out of your control, certainly when international actors do things that you cannot control. It is such a difficult area to work in. For, I think, people like you to bring about that knowledge and that history and bringing in the public perception too. I hope there's more of inclusion of these different groups and of these different actors, a more well-rounded understanding of the role of the U.S. and China in global politics. And I appreciate you so much for your expertise and everything that you're doing, especially with this new book for you. I mean, an early congratulations to you for coming out with a work like this. I look forward to reading it myself and sharing with all the people I know who are interested. I'm sure there's plenty in the Bush School who are going to be, who could maybe add this to the reading list.
And finally, I'd just like to say, this book, it's a new project. It's, kind of thematically similar to my dissertation, but completely new work. And I kind of got the approval for this book, the contract, in October 2020, during the height of COVID, and I had to kind of research it remotely and then write it, over the next 2 years, research and write it. So it was a very quick turnaround. And I really couldn't have done it without my now wife, Heather, who was kind of with me pretty much through the whole process, the research, the writing, the periods where I'm being very productive, the periods where I'm not, and especially in the summer months of 2022, when I had the book about half finished and had to do the other half and had to do a lot of writing and then do more research and then do more writing before the school year started. And she was there to help support me. And, I really couldn't have done that without her. So I just wanted to mention her.
That's great. That's great. It sounds like she's such an integral part of what you do. And
yes,
obviously give my best regards to her. Once again, Jeff, thank you so much for coming on Friends and Fellow Citizens, for sharing your wisdom, all that. Hope you come back one day.
I hope so too. And best of luck with your podcast and with your future studies.
Thank you all so much for listening to this episode with Dr. Jeffre Crean. I hope you enjoyed our discussion about history of U.S. China relations from a public perception perspective. Have a great rest of your week, and remember, a day in America is always better when we are with our friends and fellow citizens.